is Lee Forrester, TCS Honcho. Time for another installment of Metal on Metal TCS Talk. Today we're going to be looking at artillery. This is a big deal. Artillery is one of the main factors in TCS games, so we'll go over the basic rules on artillery and stick an example in there for you to see how artillery fire is resolved. Artillery fire happens during the artillery and aircraft phase. We'll talk about that first. We won't talk about aircraft in this video. That'll come up later. We'll talk about batteries and battalions, how you expend ammo to conduct artillery fires. We'll talk about observation. Now, I may keep calling this spotting because in old TCS, for the first 20 years, we called this spotting. Now, in the newest edition of TCS rules, we're calling this observation so that we don't get confused with spotting, which is actually seeing units to fire at them, so we don't confuse those two. We'll talk about different types of artillery missions and how they're executed, how to adjust fire, the role of barrage markers, and what happens to those pesky P targets, tanks, and such when they're subjected to artillery fire. The basics are, as I mentioned, these are executed during the artillery and aircraft phase, which is at the beginning of the turn. So both sides will do their artillery fire and aircraft fires before you go to the action phases. There are a number of steps to executing missions. Both players will do each step in sequence before moving to the next step. This is an initiative order. In other words, I think there are about 5 steps. One player does not go through the first 5 steps and then the other player. Each player will do step 1 in initiative order and then step 2 in initiative order, etc. And ammo is basically, there's different kinds of ammo. The main one is HE fires. Those are for your typical artillery missions. That's not counting smoke or illum, which I will talk about later. The basic ammo consumption is for each battery that shoots, and artillery units are split into batteries and battalions. For each battery that fires, that expends 1 battery fire. To fire 3 or 4 batteries together in a battalion fire expends 3 fires. And there are a couple of special missions, one for fast fire and one for continuous fire missions. Each of those expends 3 times that amount. So a fast fire battery is 3, a fast fire battalion is 9, and if you were to do a fast fire, continuous fire, battalion fire, for whatever reason, you're going to burn 27 ammo, which will probably be your entire ammo for the day in that one mission. Mission executions. This happens. First of all, you place a mission. Players will put down their markers where they wish to conduct these missions in initiative order, and both players will go through this step together. So you'll see battalion markers or battery markers for both sides out on the map at the same time. Then the next step is to roll adjustment. That is to see how these missions are conducted. Are they good fires, that is full effect? Are they bad fires where they're off target? Or do they scatter, or they actually not even conducted, a no fire? After you conduct adjustment rolls for all the missions that are placed on the map, then you fire for effect for each one. And that's not going to matter so much in what order you do them. Both sides' artillery markers have a sort of a range, which I'll talk about in a second. That is how far away from the actual marker they affect things. And these are cumulative in this fact. And it happens every now and then that both friendly and enemy artillery missions are in the same area, and they'll add up together. So after you fire for effect, then you remove all the barrage markers, with the exception of continuous fire, which I'll talk about later. And as I mentioned, each of these phases is done in initiative order. So the initiative player does his first, and then the other for step 1, for step 2, for step 3, and then this step here. Observation. In order to fire for an artillery mission, and nearly all this artillery is off map. Every now and then there are some on map. You need a unit who can observe. And this observing unit needs to have an unblocked line of sight within the visibility to the target hex. Now, by no spotting, this means you don't actually have to be able to spot enemy units in the target hex. You can pick any target hex as long as it's in line of sight. The spotting, or excuse me, I knew I was going to confuse that. The observing unit needs to be in fire mode, and it may not be suppressed or paralyzed. Some games have further specifications, such as it must be an infantry platoon, and some TCS games have dedicated observers. That is, not any unit can do it. It has to be a particular observing unit. One exception, which I'll talk about in another video, is illum missions, illumination rounds. They don't need a spotter. You can fire those anywhere on the map without a spotter being, without an observer being present. So here are our basic mission types. HE, high explosives, that's the main one. You can conduct these as battery or battalion fires. There's also smoke and aluminum, which I will cover later. A battery mission affects one target hex with its attack zone, but it also affects all surrounding 6 hexes to a lesser extent. Those aren't considered the attack zone, which is important for firing against point targets, but it does have an effect, and generally it's half. So if we have or actually it's full. So if we have say an HE mission with a battery that has a firepower of 12, as we'll talk about later, it's going to be doubled in the attack zone, so it'll fire here with a 24, and it'll affect the rest with just its basic strength of 12. If you fire a battalion mission, which generally requires 3 and sometimes 4 batteries, it will have an attack zone equal to these hexes here, and then the normal effect will be out 1 additional hex. So you can see that's quite an area of effect for these missions. That's for HE missions. Fast fire is a special modifier. It can only be fired by artillery. It's 122 millimeters or smaller. It consumes 3 times the ammo and increases the fire strength by 2, so it doubles it. In other words, if we had looked back at this here, and I had fired my 12 strength firepower battery as a fast fire mission, it's going to be doubled for the attack zone and then doubled again. So it'll hit this with a total strength of 48 and the rest here of 24. So that's quite a punch it can pack. But you do burn through the ammo quite quickly when you do this. So you got to be careful with these. And just in terms of the actual effect, if you double the fire strength, that usually leads to a total effect of about 1.4 more. So it's not a linear effect, it's a little bit more logarithmic. So you're not actually doubling the effect of your ammo, you're multiplying it by a factor of 1.4, so increasing it by 40%. Is that worth it or not? That's up to the player. Continuous fire is another kind of mission. This expends 3 times the ammo and fires at half the fire strength. So in our example before, if a continuous fire here is being fired with a fire strength of 12, or fire factor of 12, it's only going to have a 12 here and a 6 out to that. So it's a lot less. What's the bonus? The barrage marker stays on the map after the aircraft and artillery phase, which means that the fire, that this attack zone here will block line of sight. That might be useful to you. And also any units that move next to the marker. And again, if it's this marker here, any unit which moves here will be attacked by the artillery mission during the rest of the turn. So obviously you use continuous fire missions to try to interdict enemy movement. And also perhaps it has some use blocking line of sight. It's expensive though. So again, it's something that players will use only when when the situation calls for it and they have a lot of extra ammo sitting around. So we've talked about putting all the markers out on the map. We've talked about the different fire missions. How do you see what happens to these things? This is called adjustment. And here I talked about the strength, just real briefly about the firepower and the fast fire missions. It's a barrage strength. So if you have to roll, and it's going to depend on the quality of your army and some other factors, whether you actually have a good shoot, a bad shoot, or it scatters, or there's a no shoot. So just because you point the artillery there doesn't mean you're going to get a good result. Good shoots have full normal strength. Bad shoots conduct the mission normally, but at half the fire strength. Scattering, you have to roll on the scatter table to see what happens. This is a bad shoot, and it goes perhaps somewhere you don't want it to go, and this can be pretty dangerous to you if you have your own friendly units very close to the target hex. And if you roll particularly poorly, if you roll a 6 on the scatter, the enemy player gets to adjust the mission to within 3 hexes to where he wants it. So again, this is a discouragement to lesser able armies to fire artillery close into their own units because they may subject themselves to friendly fire if they don't roll particularly well. Let's take a look at the adjustment table. Each nation will start, here's a list here, the US, well, are considered the best. This can also be dependent on the actual scenario or the actual game. But if it's not otherwise given, these are the basic columns that you start on for adjusting artillery. Then you apply some modifiers. Is the spotter, or here we should say the observer, is the observer on a prepared defense op sheet? Is the observer assigned or an unassigned or on a move op sheet? That's less good. If you have an altitude benefit, if you're higher by 40 meters or more than the target hex, you get a plus. Night is bad. The further the range from the observer, it's going to be worse there. Sorry, I've got an old table here. These should be replaced with observer, etc. These shifts are all cumulative. So ideally, you want to be on a prepared defense and shoot in observing somebody close up, whatever. Go find a column. Perhaps it's 7 for the mission. So then I'll roll the normal D11 to 66. And you can see here that there's a pretty good chance on a 7, a 1 out of 3, it's going to be a no-shoot. Here's a chance for a scatter. That's about a 5 out of 36, a significant chance. Then a bad shoot. The actual chances of a good shoot are pretty low. So that's where expending lots of ammo on fast fires can come in to bring the strength back up, even if you don't get such a good result. Obviously, you want to have as far over to the right as you can. And this you'll see in different games how this plays out, whereas a German, a Commonwealth, or U.S. force may have very effective artillery. The Soviets may have a bunch of artillery, but if they're starting on the 8 column and not observing too close, perhaps at the 7+, you'll see right away the chances of a good shoot are only 1 out of 36. So although the Soviets may have plenty of tubes, you're not going to see an awful lot of impact on the battlefield. So here is an example of a barrage marker. A nice battalion with 29 is a pretty heavy punch. If you have a number of these out on the map, what you do is you add all the fire strengths of each marker and then get the total of the fire strength on that hex and execute it at one time. So it's possible that multiple barrage markers can be on the map and add up. Now when you place barrage markers, one of the restrictions is you can only place one per hex. So you can't stack them all up into one hex. However, sometimes barrage markers will scatter, and sometimes you will place a number of barrage markers all next to each other, and they may add up, and this can have quite an impact on the hex. If a barrage marker remains on the map, as I mentioned, you attack units that move through it. In that situation, only the units themselves that are moving are affected. One modifier to morale results from artillery barrage attacks is that the defending player, if he desires, the person being attacked by the barrage can turn and save yourself retreat into a paralyzed result. In other words, you don't have to get up and retreat through massive barrages just because you got a bad morale roll. The troops decide that the best thing is simply to stick to the ground and not move, as opposed to get up and try to run through the barrage. It should make sense when you think about it. Now, what happens to P targets? B targets are treated normally. So B targets are totally affected by barrages, and they're just traded with all the rest of the A targets together. If you have a P target, it's not affected by the fire table normally. Instead, you roll on the artillery point fire. And that's going to matter according to what kind of mission it is. Is it fast fire, bad shoot, is the target in move mode or not? You get a benefit in the move mode because you're scooting out of the way. Continuous fire is less effective. Smaller tubes have less effect. For each step in the hex, roll 2d6, and on a 10+, you destroy the target. Now remember, destroying here basically means knocking it out for the game, for the scenario. This can be stripping it of its, of the radio antenna or other things outside, or blocking vision slits or messing things up. It doesn't mean the target is actually destroyed. It's knocked out for the game. So, and artillery is quite good at messing things up, knocking out observation tubes, etc. Let's conduct a turn of artillery fires as an example of the rules that I've explained. This is a situation in Canadian Crucible. Germans are moving up, and the Canadians have to decide what to do with their battalion of artillery. It's the beginning of the turn, the aircraft and artillery phase. We have a nice observing stack right here, lots of juicy targets. What are we going to do with a battalion of artillery? Our first choice is, are we going to shoot one battalion mission at the cost of 3 ammo, or are we going to fire 3 separate battery missions at the cost of 3 ammo? Which is the most effective? It's a good call. If we fire a battalion mission, we could place it here, and these will be the attack zones, so it'll be full strength against 2 stacks. Nothing's going to be affected out there. So that's one option. Kind of a high risk, high reward. If it's a good mission, that's really nice, but if not, and it has a slightly better fire factor, you can see 16 versus 12, but if not, we've lost all of our artillery and not gotten anything done. We could also make 3 separate battery missions, which is what I'm going to opt to do, I think, here. That was going to have a slightly less effect, less fire strength, but you get 3 full hexes rather than just 2 that we're going to get because the Germans are spread out. If they were more closely grouped, then a battalion mission might be the better choice. And the chances are that at least 1 or 2 of these are going to go off and really erode the Germans' ability to attack right here. So let's conduct 3 separate missions. I'm leaving the marker off. This actually is right there. I'm just moving it to the side so you can see what's going on. All right. How are we going to observe these fires? We're going to observe from here. It's a straight line of sight to all 3 of these locations. So there's a direct line of sight. Let's go and we'll place the batteries right here. Now the Germans, if the Germans were also, we'll just say the Canadians have initiative. If the Germans had artillery, they would also place their markers right now. But just to simplify things, I'll say that the Germans don't have any artillery available at this point. But as I said, the German first step is to place the missions, and the German player would then place any missions that she or he wanted to fire. The next step we're going to go to is, we've already checked for observation that works fine. We need to go and see how effective these are. If we pull up our table, this is the artillery adjustment table that we looked at a little bit earlier. The range here is 3, 3, and 4. We'll say the Canadians are dug in, and I don't see any other modifiers going on. So if we take a look at the table, spotters on a prepared defense op sheet, that's a +1. The Canadians count as Commonwealth, so they're going to start on the 10 column. That will be their initial starting. We see it right down here. +1 shift for being on a prepared defensive op sheet. We look through here. There is one that's going to have a -1 because spotter at range of 4 to 6. That's this stack over here. Otherwise, it looks like pretty good. So we're going to be firing on the 11 table. And I'll just execute these live to see how it goes. So we're going to observe for this on the 11. I'm going to roll the dice, and I rolled a 45. So let's again look at that table right here. A 45 on the 11 is a good shoot. Very nice. So we're going to move this over. When I just move this here, this is a battalion good right there. Let's do this next one. It's the same. So we'll take another roll here and see what we get. 21 on the 11. That is a bad shoot. So we're going to flip this over to the bad shoot, and that will go on top of that stack. The third one, this is going to be, it was a 10 +1 for prepared defense op sheet, but -1 for range. So this is on the 10 column. We'll take a roll here, 32 on the 10. That is also a bad shoot. So I will flip this over. So you can see, even though this is fairly optimal conditions for the Canadians, a good shoot is by no means a no-brainer. Here on the 10 column, it's about a 50-50 proposition. So we'll put these over here. Now we get to execute these. We look at the battery fire zones. The adjacent hexes are all affected, but that's not going to matter here. Each of these will be separate. If this were here, then this would add its strength to that and would attack this at a somewhat lesser effect. And it could be, in some occasions, a fine thing to fire 3 missions, all like 1 on top and 2 next to a target, to really try to hit it. It's not effective, or efficient, I should say. It's not efficient, but if it's really an important situation, you might find yourself wanting to do that. So let's take a look here. These guys are in fire mode. It's in the attack zone. If you look over here, an HC mission is 2 times the firepower in an attack zone. And adjacent, it's going to be a regular firepower. So this is a 24. And we'll look at stacking. Now this is a B1 target. They're half tracks. It's not a P target because you don't have the yellow there. But B targets are affected just like area targets. So our stacking here is 5 + 1 is 6. If we go to the fire table, that's going to be no modifier for stacking. They are open in fire mode, so that's pretty much a 0 right over there. So it's going to be a straightforward attack on the 24 column. So right over here, let's make a die roll and see what happens. 44 on the 24. Is that right? Right. 44 is going to be a -1 step on this. So that's not too bad. I'm not going to, well, I guess I can't, now I'm not going to bother putting the minus. There'd be a -1 step and a morale check, and that step's going to come from the largest unit, which is right here. So that's not a bad effect. Now, this is a battery fire of 5. It's doubled as 10. Nothing special here. Its stacking is 7 or less, so there's going to be no modifiers. We'll take the roll of 14. That's going to do, on the 10, absolutely nothing. No effect. Over here, we've got also a 5. That's going to be doubled to a 10. And the stacking for area fire is 5, but there's also a point target here. So we'll have to deal with that on the point fire table. First of all, let's see if we do anything to this target. 34 at 10. That's going to be a morale check that I'll have to do. I'm not going to worry about that right now. If they were to SYR, you have the option to let them just turn that into a paralyzed so they don't have to retreat through the fire zone here. Now, there are tanks. 3 steps of tanks here. What do we do with them? We look at the, let's see where it is, the point fire versus artillery table. Let's see, here we go. Artillery point fire table. So there are 3 targets. We're going to get 3 rolls. Our normal roll we need is a 10. It's not a fast fire, it's a bad shoot. Now we need an 11. The target is not in move mode, and it's not continuous. It's not 90-minute or less. These are 105s. So I'm going to roll 3 times for 2d6, and an 11 plus destroys a target. Let's take the first roll. 11. 2, 10. So we actually plunked one of these tanks, and this tank will take a step loss. The odds were about 1 out of 12, so that was a lucky shot. What you just saw there is a pretty normal effect for firing an entire battalion this close up by dug-in troops with 105s. A step loss, luckily hit a vehicle, a morale check. So yes, artillery is queen of the battlefield, but you're not going to always see in one turn a massive effect of the artillery wiping out the opponent. Play this out, however, over several hours, let's say 9 to 12 turns, and there's going to be a lot of attrition happening with this artillery, but you're going to burn through a lot of ammo too. If the Canadians have 30 ammo, they can do what they just did there 10 times before they're out of ammo. So artillery is very effective, especially over several turns, but you got to husband your ammo carefully so that you save it for when it's really important and not waste it on long range plink shots that don't really have much of an effect. I will add tactically, one reason artillery is great too is it suppresses people. And if you, when we get to recovery, I think we've talked about recovery actually already. If you have a continuous fire mission on top of a stack, it can't recover morale. So that's one way of keeping your opponent pinned down. So what did we talk about in this video? We talked about artillery fires being conducted at the beginning of each turn during the artillery and aircraft phase. We talked about batteries, battalions, and how ammo is expended. We talked about observation, which I continue to confuse with spotting, but it's observation, how units can do that. We talked about different kinds of artillery missions, particularly HE missions, which is the main type for doing harm to your opponent, and we left illum and smoke missions for a later video. We talked about how to roll for adjustment for each barrage that you make to see what effect it has, if any, the role that barrage markers play if they're left on as continuous fires during the turn, and how to execute fires against point targets. In the next video, we will talk about movement.